The arrival of the railroad in the 19th century marked a pivotal moment in American history, fundamentally altering the fabric of Native American societies. With the roar of steam engines and the clatter of iron tracks, the once untamed landscape of North America was transformed, bringing both opportunity and devastation. As the rails carved their way across the continent, they opened the door to rapid westward expansion, enabling settlers to flood the plains, mountains, and deserts in search of new opportunities. Commerce flourished, towns blossomed overnight, and a nation was forever changed. But for the Native American tribes, whose lives were intimately connected to the land, this progress came at an unfathomable cost. The railroads severed the ties between the tribes and their ancestral homelands, disrupting not only the physical space they had inhabited for centuries but also the spiritual and cultural practices that defined their existence. The buffalo, which was more than just a source of sustenance but a symbol of their way of life, was hunted to near extinction, decimating the heart of many plains tribes. As the iron horses roared across their lands, the Native American people found themselves caught in the crosshairs of a new era, one that would challenge the very core of their identities. The promise of progress, so heralded by the builders of the railroads, was a double-edged sword for the tribes. Before the arrival of the railroad, Native Americans lived in harmony with their environment, deeply connected to the vast, open lands that stretched across the continent. The land was not just a place to live but a sacred space, imbued with the spirits of their ancestors and the essence of their cultures. Tribes like the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Comanche relied on the buffalo for food, clothing, tools, and even shelter. Their entire way of life was intricately woven into the rhythms of nature. The buffalo roamed the plains in massive herds, providing for the needs of the people who lived in sync with their migrations. In the forests and river valleys, other tribes engaged in agriculture, hunting, and fishing, living off the land in ways that sustained both their communities and the environment. Their societies were rich with tradition, and their spiritual practices revolved around the land. Storytelling, art, and ceremonies were central to preserving their history and passing down their values to future generations. Their cultures thrived, protected by the vast expanses of land that separated them from the growing encroachments of European settlers. But the peace they had known for generations would soon be shattered. With the completion of the Pacific Railroad from 1863 to 1869, the first of many transcontinental lines was born, forever altering the landscape of Native American life. The dream of connecting the East and West coasts by rail was a monumental achievement, and for many, it represented the triumph of American ingenuity and the promise of progress. However, the railroad's path through the heart of the continent meant that the lands long held sacred by indigenous tribes would become battlegrounds for survival. Settlers, lured by the promise of free land under the Homestead Act of 1862, began pouring into the West in droves. These settlers brought with them new ideas about land ownership, agriculture, and industry, clashing with the communal and spiritual land practices of the Native American tribes. As the iron rails stretched farther westward, more and more of the tribe's lands were taken, often through treaties that were either coerced or blatantly ignored by the U.S. government. The westward march of the railroad was relentless, and as it progressed, it left in its wake a trail of broken promises and shattered lives. The cultural and environmental impacts of the railroad were profound and far-reaching. For many tribes, the railroad not only brought settlers but also soldiers, tasked with enforcing the government's policies of relocation and containment. Native American tribes were forced onto reservations, confined to small, often inhospitable areas of land, far from the fertile hunting grounds and river valleys they had once known. The once vast buffalo herds, decimated by hunters who used the railroads to transport hides and meat to eastern markets, were reduced to a fraction of their original numbers. The destruction of the buffalo was catastrophic for the plains tribes, who relied on the animal for every aspect of their lives. Without the buffalo, their traditional ways of life crumbled, leaving them dependent on government rations and aid. The loss of their land and their primary food source eroded not only their physical well-being but also their cultural identity. The construction of the railroads also brought environmental degradation on an unprecedented scale. The vast forests that once covered large parts of the continent were clear-cut to provide timber for railroad ties. leaving behind barren landscapes where ecosystems once thrived. Rivers were dammed or diverted to make way for tracks, disrupting the natural water sources that many tribes depended on for drinking, fishing, and irrigation. Fertile plains were plowed under to create farmland for settlers, drastically altering the landscape and further displacing Native American tribes. The relentless push for progress left little room for the careful stewardship of the land that the Native American tribes had practiced for centuries. Instead, the land was exploited for short-term gains, with little thought given to the long-term consequences. The cultural impact of the railroad was just as devastating as the environmental one. As settlers poured into the West, they brought with them new social and economic pressures that Native American tribes were ill-equipped to handle. Traditional practices like hunting, fishing, and crafting were devalued as Western goods flooded the market. The tribes were forced to adopt new forms of labor, trading, and interaction with the non-native communities that now surrounded them. Many were compelled to work as laborers on the railroads that had displaced them, a bitter irony that only deepened the sense of loss and betrayal. The cultural invasion didn't stop there. The influx of settlers also brought with it new religious and educational institutions, which sought to civilize Native American children by forcibly removing them from their families and placing them in boarding schools. These schools, often run by religious organizations, aimed to erase Native American languages, traditions, and identities, replacing them with Western values and practices. The psychological and cultural damage inflicted by these institutions would ripple through generations, leaving scars that are still felt today. As the railroad continued its relentless march across the continent, the Native American tribes found themselves pushed to the brink of extinction. Their lands were gone, their food sources were depleted, and their cultures were under siege. The few remaining tribes were either forced onto reservations or fought to the death in a series of bloody conflicts with the U.S. Army. The wars and battles that erupted during this period were brutal and often one-sided. As the military sought to crush any resistance to the government's policies of westward expansion, many tribes, weakened by years of fighting, famine, and disease, were unable to resist the overwhelming force of the U.S. Army. Those who survived were left to live out their days on reservations, far from the lands they had once called home. In the end, the railroad was a symbol of both progress and destruction. It brought prosperity and opportunity to millions of settlers, transforming the United States into a continental power. But it also brought untold suffering to the Native American tribes, whose lives and cultures were forever changed by the iron rails that crisscrossed their lands. The railroad's legacy is one of both triumph and tragedy, a reminder of the cost of progress and the resilience of the human spirit. Today, as we look back on this transformative period in history, we must remember not only the achievements of the railroad but also the price that was paid by the Native American tribes who were swept aside in the name of progress. Their stories, once silenced by the roar of the steam engines, are now being heard again, reminding us of the importance of preserving both our history and the cultures that enrich it. The arrival of the railroad brought profound changes to the economic and cultural fabric of Native American communities. As the iron rails sliced through their lands, a new reality began to emerge. One that forced indigenous peoples to adapt in ways they had never anticipated. For centuries, these communities had thrived through a balanced relationship with their environment, relying on hunting, gathering, and agriculture to sustain themselves. The buffalo, a keystone of life for many plains tribes, provided everything from food to clothing to tools. Yet with the railroad came settlers, traders, and entrepreneurs who disrupted these traditional ways of life, forever altering the course of Native American history. Forced from their ancestral lands, the tribes faced a stark new reality: how to survive in a world where their key resources were rapidly disappearing, and their territories were shrinking. The displacement of Native Americans from their lands marked the beginning of a long and painful process of economic and cultural adaptation. The railroad not only brought settlers but also traders who established trading posts along the routes. These trading posts became hubs of commerce, where Native Americans began exchanging crafts, furs, and other goods for Western manufactured items. For many tribes, this marked their first direct exposure to new economic practices, including barter and trade with non-native communities. However, this exchange was rarely equitable. Native Americans, often unfamiliar with Western market systems, found themselves at a disadvantage. Their goods were undervalued, and they were frequently exploited by traders who sought to profit from their desperation. Over time, this trade would further erode the economic independence of Native American tribes, making them increasingly reliant on outside markets and goods. Life on reservations presented a new set of challenges. Stripped of their fertile lands, tribes found it nearly impossible to continue traditional hunting and agricultural practices. The buffalo, once abundant, had been decimated by settlers and rail workers. This left Native Americans with few options for sustenance. As a result, many tribes were forced to depend on government rations and aid, a humiliating and inadequate system that further diminished their autonomy. The rations provided by the government were often of poor quality and insufficient to meet the needs of the people. This dependency on government aid only deepened the economic hardships faced by Native American communities, creating a cycle of poverty and dependence that was difficult to break. To survive in this new reality, many Native Americans had no choice but to seek wage labor. The concept of wage labor was foreign to them, as their economies had traditionally been communal and based on subsistence practices. Nevertheless, the railroad provided opportunities for some to find work as ranch hands, farm laborers, or even in railroad construction and maintenance. This work was grueling and often paid poorly, yet it became necessary for many to support their families. For the first time, Native Americans were working not for the benefit of their communities but for wages in an economy that devalued their skills and contributions. The shift to wage labor marked a significant departure from the traditional ways of life and altered the social fabric of Native American communities in profound ways. This economic shift also had implications for gender roles within Native American societies. Traditionally, men were the hunters and warriors, while women took on responsibilities related to farming, gathering, and maintaining the home. However, as men increasingly engaged in wage labor outside the community, women's roles began to change as well. Women, who had once played a central role in agricultural production, now found themselves focusing more on maintaining cultural traditions and caring for the family while the men worked. This shift in gender roles created both challenges and opportunities for Native American women. On the one hand, they were tasked with preserving their community's cultural practices during a time of great upheaval. On the other hand, they also became the backbone of their family's survival, shouldering the burdens of both cultural preservation and economic adaptation. Despite the economic hardships brought on by the railroad, Native American communities proved resilient. Though their way of life had been severely disrupted, many tribes found ways to adapt and survive. Some adopted new agricultural techniques, while others became skilled traders, using their knowledge of the land and resources to navigate the changing economy. However, these adaptations often came at a high cost, as Native American communities had to sacrifice many of their traditional practices to fit into the new economic order. The loss of economic independence was a bitter pill to swallow, especially for communities that had once thrived in harmony with their environment. In addition to economic challenges, the railroad era also brought significant cultural upheaval. Western education and religious practices were introduced to Native American communities, often forcibly. Boarding schools were established with the explicit goal of assimilating Native American children into Western culture. These schools sought to erase Native languages, traditions, and spiritual practices, replacing them with English language instruction and Christian teachings. The psychological and cultural toll of these institutions was immense. Children were separated from their families for months or even years, stripped of their cultural identities, and taught to reject their heritage. Many never returned home, and those who did often struggled to reintegrate into their communities, feeling alienated from both their traditional culture and the Western world they had been thrust into. Despite these efforts to assimilate them, Native American communities found ways to resist. Cultural preservation became a form of resistance, as tribes held onto their traditions in the face of overwhelming pressure to conform. Secret gatherings, oral traditions, and clandestine ceremonies allowed tribes to pass down their cultural knowledge, even as the government and religious institutions sought to suppress it. Over time, these acts of resistance evolved into full-fledged cultural revitalization movements. Tribes reaffirmed their identities, languages, and spiritual practices. finding strength in their heritage even as they adapted to the new economic and social realities of the railroad era. The economic and cultural changes brought by the railroad were not universally accepted by Native American communities. Many resisted these changes through armed conflict and legal battles. The railroad's encroachment on native lands violated numerous treaties, leading to violent clashes between Native American tribes and the U.S. government. Leaders like Sitting Bull, Crazy Horse, and Geronimo became symbols of Native American resistance, fighting to defend their lands and way of life. These leaders, along with their followers, engaged in numerous battles with the U.S. Army, most notably the Battle of the Little Bighorn in 1876. Though the Native Americans achieved a stunning victory in this battle, the broader war was one they could not win. The U.S. government, with its superior numbers and resources, eventually subdued most Native American resistance, forcing the remaining tribes onto reservations. Yet resistance did not end with military defeat. Many Native American leaders turned to legal and political avenues to assert their rights. Leaders like Chief Joseph of the Nez Perce argued passionately for their people's right to remain on their ancestral lands, using moral and legal principles to make their case. Although these efforts were often met with resistance and ultimately failed, they laid the groundwork for future legal victories in the ongoing struggle for Native American rights. Over time, Native American tribes would achieve significant legal and political gains, though the scars of the railroad era would never fully heal. The legacy of the railroad in Native American history is one of both devastation and resilience. The economic and cultural transformations it brought were profound, forcing Native American communities to adapt in ways that forever altered their way of life. Yet despite the immense challenges, Native American tribes found ways to survive, resist, and ultimately reclaim their identities. The railroad may have symbolized progress for many Americans, but for Native American communities, it represented the loss of their lands, their resources, and their independence. Today, as we reflect on this transformative period in history, we must recognize both the achievements of the railroad and the profound impact it had on the indigenous peoples of North America. Their story is one of endurance in the face of overwhelming odds, a testament to the strength of their cultures and the resilience of their spirits. The arrival of the railroad in the 19th century was a turning point in Native American history, a transformative moment that reshaped the economy, culture, and future of indigenous communities. As the iron rails stretched across the plains, deserts, and forests of North America, they brought with them new opportunities but also unprecedented challenges. Native American tribes were displaced from their ancestral lands, forced to abandon traditional ways of life as the buffalo herds they relied upon were hunted nearly to extinction. With the land stripped away, these communities had to navigate new economic realities, often turning to wage labor, trading with settlers, and finding ways to adapt to an industrialized world that devalued their heritage. Yet, even in the face of such hardships, the Native American spirit remained unbroken. Over time, many tribes found ways to blend elements of Western society with their cultural identity, creating a new path forward. Modern adaptations played a crucial role in the survival and eventual flourishing of Native American communities. With the rise of tribal enterprises, casinos, and tourism, many tribes found new sources of revenue that celebrated their culture while providing employment and financial stability. These ventures helped preserve their unique heritage, turning adversity into an opportunity to showcase their customs, art, and traditions to the world. By welcoming outsiders into their communities, tribes not only gained economic independence but also ensured that their stories and traditions would be passed down to future generations. This resurgence of culture and pride fueled a movement of revitalization that has continued into the modern day. Education and political activism have become central pillars in Native American communities' efforts to build a brighter future. Tribal colleges and educational programs, founded to offer culturally relevant education, empower young people to take pride in their heritage while gaining the skills necessary to succeed in the broader world. These institutions have become havens of learning and cultural preservation, where students can explore their identity and learn about the histories that were once suppressed. In tandem with education, political activism has played a significant role in the Native American resurgence. Organizations like the American Indian Movement AIM brought national attention to issues such as treaty rights, land reclamation, and social justice. Through protests, legal battles, and advocacy, Native American leaders have achieved significant policy reforms and legal victories that have gradually begun to right the wrongs of the past. The story of the railroad's impact on Native American lives does not end with the 19th century. Its legacy continues to reverberate through the experiences of indigenous communities today. The efforts to reclaim land, revitalize languages, and preserve cultural practices remain critical components of Native American life. This blend of tradition and modern innovation has allowed tribes to stay connected to their heritage while navigating the contemporary world. Environmental restoration projects have become a crucial part of this healing process. Native American tribes are actively involved in conservation efforts, using their traditional ecological knowledge to repair the damage caused by the railroad and subsequent industrial activities. These initiatives not only restore the land but also strengthen the spiritual and cultural bond between Native Americans and their ancestral homelands. Cultural revival events, language revitalization programs, and educational initiatives are flourishing, empowering new generations to embrace and celebrate their heritage. Tribal colleges, cultural centers, and language programs play a critical role in fostering a sense of community and identity among Native American youth. These efforts are essential for maintaining the cultural diversity and richness that have long defined Native American societies. By reclaiming their languages and traditions, tribes are ensuring that their stories, values, and histories continue to thrive for generations to come. Political and legal activism has also remained a driving force in the fight for Native American rights. The legacy of historical injustices has not been forgotten, and ongoing policy reforms, along with landmark legal victories, are helping to rectify the wrongs of the past. Native American voices are being heard more prominently, both locally and internationally, as tribes advocate for their rights to land, resources, and cultural preservation. Through these efforts, Native American communities are reclaiming their place in the broader narrative of American history, ensuring that their contributions, struggles, and triumphs are recognized. Economic development initiatives such as tribal enterprises, casinos, and tourism have provided new opportunities for growth and self-sufficiency. These ventures have not only generated revenue but also promoted cultural tourism, inviting people from around the world to learn about and appreciate Native American cultures. By turning their cultural heritage into an asset, tribes have found a way to ensure both their economic future and the preservation of their traditions. The success of these enterprises has inspired a new sense of pride and purpose within Native American communities, as they continue to build on the resilience that has carried them through generations of adversity. The arrival of the Transcontinental Railroad to the Plains heralded a complicated history of hardship, strength, and recovery for Native American tribes. It is essential to remember that the consequences of the railroad's construction were not uniform across all tribes. Each tribe faced its own unique set of challenges as settlers encroached on their lands and the railroad expanded. For instance, the Pawnee sought to cultivate friendly relationships with settlers, while other tribes, like the Lakota and Cheyenne, resisted fiercely. These varying responses reflect the diversity of Native American experiences during this period of rapid change. Today, Native American tribes are not only surviving but thriving, drawing from their rich cultural heritage to build a brighter future. Their resilience continues to inspire younger generations to strive for even more. As we reflect on this chapter of American history, we must recognize both the pain and the resilience that define the story of Native American communities. The loss of land, resources, and autonomy was devastating, but it did not extinguish the spirit of the indigenous peoples. Instead, it fueled a determination to preserve their cultures, adapt to new realities, and reclaim their place in the world. The story of the railroad and its impact on Native American lives is one of profound transformation, offering valuable lessons about the power of community, identity, and the unyielding spirit of a people. And with that, we wrap up today's episode. Thank you for joining us once again as we explore these untold stories of our past. We hope you found this discussion insightful and inspiring. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to hit the subscribe button for more content that delves deep into the rich history and heritage of Native American tribes. And be sure to turn on the notification bell so that you'll be the first to know when we release new videos. Stay tuned for more, and we'll see you in the next episode.